One Georgetown law professor says this: Trump also firing the Army, Navy, and Air Force JAGs. In some ways, that's even more chilling than firing the 4 stars. It's what you do when you're planning to break the law. You get rid of any lawyers who might try to slow you down. Your response to her?
Yeah, I don't know who Rosa is and what her hyperbole is all about. Ultimately, we want lawyers who give sound constitutional advice and don't exist to attempt to be roadblocks to anything.
Hello, everyone. Today I've got a fairly important topic to discuss, and I'd like you to bear with me because it's going to be extremely difficult to navigate through the issue and try to explain it and then come to some sort of conclusion. The topic is about the Judge Advocate General Corps of the United States military, and I want to talk about it because it's very, very important. But before I do that, I just want to remind everybody to hit a like, share, and subscribe. Somebody got pissed off at me because the last podcast I mentioned to send the link to your dog, and evidently they didn't like that. Well, that's okay. Not all dogs have a YouTube channel, but the ones that do, please do share it with them. And the second point that I want to mention is, I provide these podcasts and I try to remain balanced and provide all sides of the issue. Our motto for the nation is E pluribus unum, from many one. So there's diverse opinion across the nation, as it should be. Because I fundamentally believe that disagreement is okay. Disagreement is the foundation of our Constitution, and that's what the freedom of speech is based upon. So it's okay to disagree. And just because I give another perspective doesn't necessarily mean that's my perspective. I think I owe it to the viewers to give a very diverse perspective from all sides. And then it's up to the viewer to decide which perspective they choose or they don't choose. That's really up to the viewer. But just because I give a perspective that you may not agree with doesn't make me a bad guy. And there's no need to start throwing out personal insults and all that stuff. I understand some of these issues are pretty heated, and we tend to get amped up. But let's just make sure that we just remain professional and don't take things personally on this, right? We're just trying to have a discourse, a professional discourse. That's the whole purpose of this channel. Okay, so now let's get back to the topic at hand, the Judge Advocate General Corps. Now, if we go back in time to 21st January when the Coast Guard Commandant was fired, the Inspectors Generals were fired, and then 22 February, a few days back, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staffs, the Chief of Naval Operations, and the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force were fired. And also on that day, all the 3 Judge Advocate Generals of the Army, Navy, and the Air Force were also fired by Defense Secretary Hexet. And these 3 individuals were Lieutenant General Joseph Berger from the Army, Air Force Lieutenant General Charles Plummer, and Rear Admiral Leah Reynolds. And this kind of really didn't hit the media. It kind of just got pushed aside because the bigger story of C.Q. Brown and the other 2 4-stars that were fired. The important issue is because of the integrity and the impartiality of the Judge Advocate General Corps. It should be an independent organization, and their job is to provide independent legal advice to senior military officials so they don't run afoul of U.S. law or the laws of armed conflict. It's really that simple. That's what they do. By removing them out of office, you've just decapitated the Judge Advocate General Corps. And that probably sends the wrong message to the military for the following reason. Because there's a law that says that no officer or employee of the Department of Defense may interfere with the JAG's ability to give independent legal advice. That's the law. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress has authority to make rules for the military. They don't want legal advice for the military coming solely from partisan political appointees. And that means, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Navy, Air Force, and the Army. They want independent legal advice coming from the Judge Advocate General Corps. So by removing the Judge Advocate General Corps, we just decapitated the entire legal system within the U.S. military. Now, the president certainly has the right to do that. And appoint new ones, and there's a board that forms and selects the new Judge Advocate General Corps, and they're appointed. But it can't be a partisan process. It has to be an independent legal process because it's very important. Because these JAGs remain independent and impartial. And I'll give you an example. Back in 2003, when President Bush authorized, torture. The Air Force JAG at the time, they call them TJAGs, the Judge Advocate General, was a lieutenant general by the name of Jack Reeves. And he was the first of the uniformed lawyers to oppose torture. And he started writing memos against that. And this turned into a big political furball. Even many senators, to include Senator Lindsey Graham, got involved in this. And he actually supported the JAG, because Lindsey Graham himself is an Air Force JAG. And he supported the Air Force JAG in his memos and said torture was wrong. And then eventually President Bush backed off. So, their job is to keep us out of trouble, so we don't run afoul of U.S. laws or international laws, Geneva Convention, and the laws of armed conflict. That's their job. One of the issues that happened in 2024 was the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of President Trump, and basically said that he enjoys presumptive complete immunity for acts within the scope of his core constitutional powers. So basically it gave him freedom to act. Previously, the president was sort of restricted from using the military in a reckless and lawless manner. Now, the only guardrail that's left for every military member is to disobey an unlawful order. That's it. And so you're not sort of protected because of this presidential immunity. He's giving you an order, he's got complete immunity, and you have to execute that order. So as legal advisors to the Department of Defense and to the military services, the role of the judge advocates becomes even more important, because they know when an order is lawful or unlawful. But if you start decapitating the top, this becomes very, very questionable. And you got to look at Pete Hegseth's view on the JAGs, right? And he used to call them jack-offs and stuff. I mean, this came out in the Senate testimony. And in his book, he says, what do you do if the enemy doesn't honor the Geneva Conventions? And in most cases, they won't honor them, right? Because they're not bound by them by a legal treaty. But that doesn't allow us to not follow our legal obligations. Because at the end of the day, in war, if you become the enemy, then the enemy is really won. Do you get my point? So we have to be very careful and navigate through these decisions in war. Now, going back to the outset, when I said that a JAG basically, provides recommendations as to the law of warfare. And then this is an important discussion, because what do you do in a situation like that, as Pete Hegseth mentions, and this concept of warrior ethos? Is it just about killing the enemy, or does it also include, such things as discipline, honor, and respect for the UCMJ? Because in combat can spin out of control very quickly. And one has to have the self-discipline to be able to control events. Because if you don't, then you essentially commit murder. And I'll give you an example. In Afghanistan, after a major gunfight, one of my Marines came running up to me. He said, "Sir, they got prisoners down in a ditch, and they're going to kill them." So I go running down there, and sure as hell, my Afghan militia's got these prisoners that we took kneeling in the ditch. And they're going to execute them. So I came running up, and I told the governor, I said, "Stop." I said, "What the hell are you doing?" And he waves me off. He goes, "This doesn't concern you, Colonel." I basically said, "No." I said, "You work for me. I'm paying you. And if you kill these prisoners, I'm going to have to kill you. And then your people are going to kill me. And then my Marines are going to kill them." I said, "We're going to have a big mess on our hands. So just let me have these prisoners, and I'll take care of them." So he's like, "Well, every time we give them to you, they come back." I said, "I promise you they won't come back this time." And so we load them up, and we sent them off, back to our higher headquarters, the MEU, and then they got sent up to Bagram, or what have you. So the point being is, the laws of combat are also designed to protect the civilians and the troops from moral injury. Because if you get involved in these mass murders and stuff, and eventually it's going to come back and haunt you. And right now we're seeing that what's happened in Gaza. For the last 16, 17 months, they bombed the shit out of Gaza. One side claims, yeah, we were mindful of the civilians, and the other side saying, no, they killed innocent women and children. At the end of the day, regardless of which side is correct, the troops have some serious traumatic issues to deal with. Not to mention the victims also. So it's very, very important that we maintain the high moral ground. And I've spoken about this in the past, and probably warrants a separate podcast, is the moral dimension of warfare. And we've sort of seemed to have forgotten about the moral dimension of warfare. Everybody brings up the bombing of Dresden and Hiroshima, But the reason the Geneva Conventions were amended was so we didn't repeat another Dresden. That's the reason. And we have to protect the civilians. So we just can't randomly go around killing people. That's not being a warrior. That's being a murderer. And it's very important to understand that distinction. So warrior ethos should follow the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And regardless if our enemies abide by them or not, it doesn't matter. So what is this thing, warrior ethos? In my simple mind, warrior ethos is discipline and commitment to mission. And you got to have that discipline. The easiest test that I try to explain to Marines is when you come to a stop sign and there's nobody around, do you stop or do you go through the stop sign? The right answer is you stop, because that's what a disciplined person does, right? So it's very important. And the second part I would say of warrior ethos is upholding the law of armed conflict or the law of warfare and the Geneva Conventions. Very, very important. Another part of warrior ethos is courage, and you got to have battlefield courage. You just can't talk about it, nor can you read about it from a book. And when you're leading troops in combat as a unit leader, you have to have the courage to be in front of them, to take greater risk, so the troops will willingly follow you. Because everybody is scared. Trust me. Everybody talks about how glorious it is going to war. War freaking sucks, man. There's nothing good that comes out of it except death and destruction. But the troops require that sage leadership, and nobody wants to be in the front because nobody really wants to get shot. But guess what? That's what you signed up for, and that's what you got to do. So part of the warrior ethos is battlefield courage. You got to be able to inspire the troops, not by giving them pep talks, by example. That's the way you got to do it. Next is loyalty, and loyalty is not only to the Constitution, but loyalty is also to your command and also to your Marines. It's a two-way street. Loyalty goes both ways, and it's also loyalty to the civilians within the battle space. You got to be loyal to them because you have to protect them as well. It's very, very important that you do so. And the next one is integrity and honor. And this is the one that we tend to violate the most. And, in little things like writing each other up for Bronze Stars or lying under when something happens and trying to cover it up. And I'll give you an example in a moment. So it's very important to have integrity, because once you compromise your integrity, you compromise your honor, and the troops see that. And once they see an officer compromising their integrity and their honor, you're done. Because then they got the goods on you, right? And you can't really hold them accountable for any mistakes they made because you just violated one of the tenets of leadership. So it's very, very important. And lastly is your moral compass and your code. You cannot, support anything that violates the UCMJ or the law of warfare. It just can't be happening. You got to have a strong moral compass. And there's a lot of times, when things happen that you want to just unleash because you have so much combat power. But a strong leader restrains that combat power and uses it judiciously. I think that's very, very important. The warrior ethos is not only knowing how to use the military, but also knowing when to use it. Sometimes you may not have to use it. Sometimes a show of force is good enough. Sometimes diplomacy is good enough, where you sit down with the locals and you talk to them about it, and to gain their trust and confidence. So that's all part of this concept of warrior ethos. The problem I have with all this is when you start covering up our mistakes, and the mistakes that we covered up, and Hexet sort of supported this, were the 3 people that were convicted for war crimes, and all 3 were pardoned by the president. Now, the bottom line is a court found them guilty. Their subordinates and their colleagues are the ones that testified against them. These guys did something wrong. Okay? Now, I understand in war, and shit happens. Stuff's going to happen. But as a good leader, as a good officer or a non-commissioned officer, the reason you have that rank is to make sure that you don't lose your warrior ethos or your moral compass. And once you lose it, then you're just a common criminal, in my opinion. So, so these 3 people were pardoned. And they're very notable cases, and I really don't want to go into and mention names. But there's one case of a lieutenant ordered his troops to fire upon some Afghans about 100 yards away, and they basically killed them, right? Then, to cover up their tracks, they filed a false report claiming that the bodies had been removed and they couldn't searching for weapons. So the whole thing got brushed aside. The Army convicted this lieutenant because his troops testified against him because he gave an unlawful order. Now, they should have probably refused the order, but they didn't. But nonetheless, so the whole thing was all convoluted. According to Hegseth's model of warrior ethos, the U.S. troops engaged in battle need to be the most ruthless, his words, the most uncompromising, and the most overwhelming lethal force on the battlefield. I understand where Hegseth is coming from, So once the gunfight starts, all gloves are off. But you just can't go around the battle space and see a bunch of innocent farmers out there, tell your soldiers to open up on them and end up killing them. That's not warrior ethos. That's being a murderer, in my opinion. When he was pardoned, his troops came out and said that, and I'll read the quote. So one of his troops said, "I thought of the army as this altruistic thing. I thought it was perfect and honorable. It pains me to tell you how stupid and naive I was." Because his lieutenant got pardoned. He wasn't held accountable. And another one said, "The lieutenant stuff just broke my faith. And once you lose your values and your faith, the army is just another job you hate." And so this impacts the good order of discipline also, because the troops ain't stupid, right? They can see through this BS. So it's important for us to uphold the law. The problem with all this is Hegseth was blaming, in his confirmation hearings, he was blaming the JAGs because of these restrictive rules of engagement. The problem is he doesn't understand how ROEs are made. ROEs are made by the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. The JAGs, all they do is they enforce the ROEs. They have nothing to do with making them. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure the JAGs help craft the ROEs because you have to glean them from the various conventions that the U.S. is party to, the Geneva Convention, the law of warfare, and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's the civilian leadership of the military that approves the ROE. So when Hegseth made that statement, he clearly had no idea what he's talking about because the JAGs don't make the ROEs restrictive. It's the civilian leadership. Now, he's in that position. And guess what? Next time we go to conflict, he's going to pay pretty close attention to what the hell ROE that he signs off for. Otherwise, he's going to be in some serious kimchi. There's an axiom out there that says, lawyers advise and commanders decide. This is very important, because the lawyers are there to advise. And I remember, when I was in combat, and a couple of times, the situation just didn't look right to me. I even got on the hook and spoke to the JAG and, told them, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is what just happened. We had a couple of squatters run into this house. And I have, probable cause to believe that they're in this building. And, this is my rationale to engage the building, because I didn't want my Marines to go in and they clear the building, and I was just going to drop a JDAM on it. And once you talk through the lawyers, and they're just there as a sounding board. And, he'll go, okay, sir, yeah, you're making sense. I advise the course of action that you've chosen. And it was just good take a moment of pause to decide before you, vaporize this building. And it was purely done to save my Marines' lives, because I didn't want to go and clear this building when I saw these guys going in there. Now, the question is, were there any civilians in there? That was the whole thing. And fortunately, in our case, there weren't any civilians, because the civilians had cleared out of this village, luckily. So, so it was good for me to have a sounding board and somebody that's slightly removed from the tactical scenario that I can talk to and say, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? What advice do you have for me? And I thought it was good. But at the end of the day, what do we do with the JAG Corps? Since the President and the Secretary of Defense have decapitated this organization. And I go back to my previous video. I think it is very, very important that the JAG Corps, the entire Corps between the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, get moved underneath as a separate entity underneath the Secretary of Defense. And that makes them independent of all the services. Because as we've discussed in previous videos, there are commanders out there that have weaponized the JAGs and the SJAs. And they use the UCMJ to their advantage, when in reality the UCMJ was created to protect the enlisted troops. But over time it's just been weaponized, because what happens is the JAG's fitness report or the SJA's fitness report is written by the commander. So he's loyal to the commander and to the institution rather than justice. So it's very important that they all get moved out of these services, and this is the time really to do it, and then get put underneath the DOD. So I think that would be very beneficial for our military. And the second thing I would do on the back of that is the inspector generals. If you go back to February 12th, when all the inspector generals were fired, to include the DOD, I would take all the IGs out of all the services and consolidate them, and again put them under the DoD as a separate independent entity, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. So that way you have this independent, impartial oversight of each service and some of the shenanigans that go on in that service headquarters. And then when a troop or a young officer files an IG complaint, it's not going to get swept under the rug or or weaponized, because I've seen it with my own eyes. You file a complaint and they turn around and they'll come and put charges on you, the UCMJ, and then you put on legal hold. Or in the case of Lieutenant Colonel Schiller, when he filed a complaint, and what they did was they turned around and they charged him and then threw him in the brig to silence him. Now think about this. We made all this hoopla after 20 years of war about somebody's mental status and PTSD, and so he files this complaint, and agree or disagree with him how he went about it. Initially went through the chain of command, and he had some issues with what happened in Afghanistan. We all do, and the chain of command basically told him, "Hey, don't worry about it," and that's the wrong answer. When they should have said, "Yeah, you got a valid point. Let's look into it." That's where Commandant Berger should have called him in and said, "Hey, stud, what's in your mind?" And let him come out and say what's on his mind. And then Berger should have taken action. He should have filed an IG complaint for accountability, but he didn't. So what he did was, he closed ranks with the other generals to protect the general in Afghanistan. And by doing so, he charged, Schiller conduct unbecoming an officer and all those other charges that he was charged with, and then threw his ass in the brig. And did he ever think about maybe it's a mental health issue also? He's looking for help. Berger didn't do that because he doesn't give a shit. All he cares about is, hey, I'm in the running for chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staffs, and I don't want to rock this boat. So and it's just flubbed up in my opinion. Nonetheless, so the reason I bring up this thing, it's fairly convoluted. It's not an easy podcast to keep track of, but by decapitating the leadership of all the JAGs in the services, we've got a serious problem brewing in front of us. We got to remain watchful and understand what the hell's going on and keep monitoring the situation, because it's important that our judiciary, the JAG Corps, remains independent and impartial advisors to the decision makers, to the military commanders and the civilian leadership of the Pentagon. That's very, very important. And more important is that the JAG Corps maintains the impartiality and equitable justice for everybody in the armed forces, not just the select few or the senior officers. So Peter Hegseth has taken a bold first step by decapitating this organization, but he can really go much further and be smart about it and unify this organization and bring it underneath the Secretary of Defense. Something that we need to remain vigilant. It's something that's brewing. It sort of went to the back burner, by the media. They really haven't paid attention because nobody really understands it, right? They're thinking, oh, it's just a bunch of lawyers. It's not. It's a very important element of our military, because it safeguards the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and it also makes sure that we abide by the law of warfare and the Geneva Conventions and other treaties that we're obligated to uphold. But above all, it ensures that we uphold our moral code, and I think that's the most important, the moral dimension of warfare, because that moral code is going to decide what the outcome is when you come back home. Because if you've done something screwed up on the battlefield, trust me, it's going to follow you all the way till the day you die. And that's not a good way to live. That's all I got. Stay rugged, stay united. Khan out.